It should come as no surprise that one of the great assets you have when it comes to delivery when you're giving a speech is your actual voice. It's not only the basic thing you're going to use when giving the speech to get the information across, but when used correctly, it can provide all types of emotional context. It can help get the audience engaged and just get caught up in what you're saying. But in order to have a good speaking voice, we need to have an understanding of what are the qualities that affect our voice and how might we need to tweak them in order to be the most effective. And what those are and how to accomplish that, that is the source of this video. Okay, so the speaking voice. Now, every one of you is going to have to develop what I would call your speaking voice or your speaking persona, because you will need to probably make deliberate changes to your voice when you give a speech. All right. Now, we're not talking anything major. We're not talking about learning a new accent, but you do need to be aware of some of these changes you might need to make, because the big thing you want to be sure that you maintain when you give a speech is your conversational quality. What I mean by that is when you give a speech, you want to sound like you're having a conversation with the audience. Now, I know you might think, well, if I want to have why wouldn't I just talk normally? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. All right. The key is, how do you make those deliberate changes to your voice while still maintaining that conversational quality? And newsflash, here's a big thing. Remember, the class is called public speaking, not public reading. You get up with a manuscript speech and try to read it to the audience, you will not have good conversational quality, and chances are your audience won't pay that much attention because it's going to sound boring. Okay, you got to get to that keyword outline and focus on talking with the audience, not speaking at them. So what are some of these aspects of your voice you want to think about? Well, first and foremost is volume. Okay. When you're talking, giving a speech in a face-to-face situation, you're going to need to speak loud enough that everybody can hear you. Now, of course, if you happen to have a microphone, that's different. But in most situations like a class or boardroom, you are going to have to talk loud enough for people to hear you. And I'm here to tell you this. You will always, 100% of the time, sound much louder to yourself than you will to your audience. Always. And there's a simple reason for this, okay? Your mouth is here. Your ear's here. That's what? A couple of inches? Sound waves dissipate the further they get from their source. Well, you're picking up here what's coming out here. That's hardly any space at all. So you will naturally gonna sound louder to you than your audience. And I will tell you that 9 out of 10 times in a face-to-face speaking situation, students need to talk louder than normal. Some of you may need to talk much louder than normal, and you may feel a little bit of uncomfortable or self-conscious. And my personal rule of thumb is this: if you do not sound to yourself like you are on the verge of screaming, you're not talking loud enough. You've got to get loud so that people can hear you clearly. And you have to establish that base level of volume so that volume changes can then create the emotional context you need. If you're talking, just get louder, well, that energy, intensity, or if I deliberately get softer, same kind of thing. But if I can't hear you in the get-go, all those changes they don't do anything because I can't hear you. Now, how this translates to, for example, online speaking, well, make sure you have a good microphone and make sure you're close enough to it that it can pick you up clearly, or that it's up loud enough that you can be detected clearly, because the last thing you want is to be recording your speech and keep cutting in and out. So make sure you have good speaking volume. Good way to practice this is have somebody listen to your speech, and in your house, wherever you live or whatever, you give your speech at the end of one hallway and your listener be sitting in a room at the other end, and practice talking loud enough that they can hear you clearly. It's a simple thing, but it can really help. Another is the pitch of your voice. Okay. Now, pitch refers to how high or low the octave or note of your voice is. Okay. Extreme example, Do you have a voice that's kind of way up here like this with a high pitch? Or do you have a voice that's way down here with a low pitch? Okay. Now, there's not much you can do with pitch, or we're going to ask you to do at this level. This is a basic level. You can do things with breathing and so forth to change it a little bit. But the main thing we want you to understand is there's the relationship between pitch and volume. Often in class, I'll have a student start with a practice speech and I can barely hear them. And I'll say, speak up. And I get this. Speak up. And they're not getting louder, they're getting higher. Okay? It's not volume, it's the octave of your voice. But what you need to understand is the relationship between pitch and volume. If you happen to have a really high voice like this, and then you try to get loud, it's going to get really shrill. Whereas if you have a lower voice like this and you try to get too soft, you'll just blank out. Okay, so understand how pitch and volume are related and make sure you're taking that into account. Another one is speaking rate. This is how fast or how slow you tend to talk. And this is important because you want to talk at a rate that is comfortable for your audience to hear and process information. Now, I will tell you that most of the time, this means for most students, making yourself talk a little slower than normal. Now, I'm not talking about something like this. That's not what I'm talking about. But you only get up and start talking like this really fast because I was going to have a hard time hearing you. The thing's going to fly by. They're not going to understand. As soon as they quit understand, they're going to, you don't talk that fast. Okay. You want to talk at a good, solid rate. Because like volume, once you talk at a good rate, you can then rate deliberate changes in rate to create emotional context. If I'm going on normal, I start talking, if I'm going on like normal, I start talking a lot more faster. Intensity, emotion. Same thing if I deliberately talk slower. Those can help build that emotional context. So how can you establish a good speaking rate? This is what my public speaking teacher told me. Gonna think I'm trying to clown on you, but I'm not. You naturally tend to speak to a beat. Okay, just like with music, there's a beat that you speak at. So when trying to establish good speaking rate, you want to practice to a good beat. Good beat per minute to make sure you're talking at that specific rate. And what is a good beat? Low setting on windshield wipers in a car. Hello, my name is John DeBerry, and today I would like to talk to you about this wonderful hobby that I found a few years ago. Yada, 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 yada. Good rate, right? Now I know some of you are thinking, is this fool telling me that I need to practice in the car with my windshield wipers on? Yes, it works. I did it. But you have an advantage that I didn't, and that you have these great things called smartphones. And so what you can find free on any app store is a metronome. Some of you may know what a metronome is. If you're not familiar with it, it's a device musicians use to keep a steady beat when they practice. So if you may have one, or you can get lots of free apps that do them, but have that making a beat sound when you're practicing. And a good beat is about 55 to 60 beats a minute. That's about what low setting on windshield wipers is. So practice with that rate, speaking at that rate, and that will establish a good base rate for conversation with your audience that you can then use rate changes for things you need to do. We also need to talk about pauses. Okay, creating silence is a really great way of emphasizing a point. Okay, if I'm going along and I say, quote, I'm here to tell you that in this country, if you have the ability to vote and you choose not to, you've got no right to complain. That pause makes further emphasis on what comes after it, all right? However, the effect of a pause is totally blown if it becomes what we call a vocalized pause. What that means is that instead of having silence, you fill that pause with some sort of vocal utterance like or a word or phrase such as like or you know. If I get up and I say, I'm here to tell you that in this country, if you have the ability to vote and you choose not to, you've got no right to complain. That totally does not have the same effect. So when you want to have pauses, be sure you create silence. What is a way that you can do this? Well, simple technique. When you want to be sure you have a vocalized pause, when you go to pause, close your mouth all the way. Some of you are like, what? Here's the thing. A lot of us have a resting face, and you've probably seen this if you ever pay attention to it, where we leave our mouth open just a little bit. Now, I'm not talking about just a little bit, but if you go to pause and you leave your mouth open just that little bit, that highly increases the probability that you'll have an or something like that. But if you close your mouth, that's not going to happen. I promise you, you will not go, in this country, if you have the right to vote and you choose not to, I'm here to tell you this. You're not going to do that, I promise. So make sure you close your mouth all the way. Now, what are some other vocal qualities we need to talk about? Well, one is vocal variety. This goes to that idea of conversational quality. You want to have these changes in volume, pitch, rate, and so forth that come across as having a conversation with the audience. You don't want to get up and talk like this the entire time because the audience is going to get really bored. But this is what will happen more than likely if you get up with a script and try to read to the audience. Because again, the class is called public speaking, not public reading. So you want to have that vocal variety. And those changes in pitch, volume, rate, and pauses can help you achieve that. Some other things you want to be sure: pronunciation. Make sure you are pronouncing your words correctly. Okay, and here's the thing. Remember your speaking notes, what we call your speaking outline? Nobody sees that other than you, all right? And this is one of those great things that's different between a speech and a paper. Since nobody sees your speaking outline but you, does spelling matter? No. So if there's a word that you have a hard time pronouncing, write it on there phonetically. Doesn't matter how it's spelled, how does it sound? And if you're unsure about how to pronounce a word, go find out. You can go to Google, all kinds of places, and find out how to pronounce these words, but make sure you're pronouncing them effectively. And also with that comes good articulation, pronouncing all the various sounds in the word. Okay, I come from Florida. That's where I was born. And that far south, people have an accent. People say, I'm going down the creek. What? And they're not articulating all the sounds. Okay, so it's not only to have good pronunciation, but make sure you're not dropping your sentences. You're maintaining that good articulation. And again, this goes back to having good speaking rate. One of the quickest ways to have your articulation tank is to be talking too fast. So that, make sure you're saying all the sounds in the word, you're saying them correctly, and a rate will help with that. Now, this brings us lastly to dialect. Okay, dialect are regional ways and phrases of saying things. Okay, now we take a different view in public speaking than you might get if you were in a broadcasting program, because they're going to teach you to speak in what's called standard American English, which is an accent-free way of speaking. For example, you ever notice that all the people you see on TV doing news all sound the same? That's why. We take a different view in public speaking in that we're not going to say that one dialect is better than the other, because you need to feel comfortable up there talking. But the heavy use of any dialect is going to be problematic because it usually inevitably comes with the use of regional colloquialisms or sayings that might not translate to an audience. So if you have an accent, you have a dialect, that's fine, no problem. But just understand you may need to slow down a bit more and stay away from those regional words and phrases, because they are what will cause you some problems. So your voice is a fantastic tool that you have as a speaker to really help get your message and the emotional context across to the audience. And paying attention to these various aspects of your voice that we discussed in this video will give you the tools that you need in order to use your voice to its most effective way. That name even made no sense, but you know what I'm talking about. Basically, make your voice the tool it needs to be and do it effectively. Thank you.